This video focuses on the moral schism within American society during the Vietnam War and the profound conflict between personal conscience and state authority. It is not merely about political protest, but about the moment when a personal choice proved stronger than a state order. The scale of resistance was enormous. Over 210,000 Americans were charged with draft evasion. Of this number, approximately 8,800 people were convicted, and about 3,250 were sent to prison. Around 4,000 of them received prison sentences specifically for refusing to serve based on conscientious objection. This tone was set on April 28, 1967. At the Houston Induction Center stood a young boxer at the peak of his fame, world champion Muhammad Ali. He refused to step forward. Silence filled the room, and journalists hung on his every word. Ali did not just refuse to serve, he refused to be silent, declaring, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." Behind this gesture lay a whole philosophy. If you are a champion, you must defend justice, even if it costs you everything. The early 1960s were marked by the first, often desperate acts of protest, which became the sparks of an organized movement where self-sacrifice was a form of political statement. Gene Keys, the first pyre. On December 24, 1963, 22-year-old Gene Keys in Champaign, Illinois, became the first American to publicly burn his draft card, choosing Christmas as a symbol of the Christian message. Alice Hertz, the fire of love. On March 16, 1965, 82-year-old peace activist, German Jew, and Nazi refugee Alice Hertz self-immolated in Detroit. She died on March 26, 1965, from severe burns. She became the first American to use self-immolation as an act against the Vietnam War. She accused President Johnson of using military force to destroy entire countries. Her act was a cry of conscience, ban on burning cards. In August 1965, Congress passed a law criminalizing the burning of draft cards as a federal felony. Maximum penalty, 5 years in jail, and a $10,000 fine, thereby acknowledging the power of the symbolic gesture of resistance. David Miller, the first convict. On October 15, 1965, 22-year-old pacifist David Miller, a member of the Catholic worker movement, became the first arrested and convicted under this law. He burned his card in front of TV cameras at an anti-war rally in New York at the Armed Forces Induction Center on Whitehall Street in Manhattan. Miller was sentenced to 3 years in prison in February 1966. He actually served approximately 22 months, beginning in June 1968 and released around April 1970. Miller stated, "I am destroying it, to destroy the license to kill." Norman Morrison, The Exodus. On November 2, 1965, 31-year-old Quaker Norman Morrison, a father of 3, self-immolated beneath Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's Pentagon window, managing to set his 11-month-old daughter Emily safely aside. He used kerosene to immolate himself. McNamara later admitted that this single human gesture pierced the armor of the state machine. In fact, McNamara later acknowledged that November 1965 was the month when he began experiencing serious doubts about the war. Roger Laporte, The Silent Scream. On November 9, 1965, 22-year-old former seminarian and member of the Catholic worker movement, Roger Laporte, self-immolated in front of the UN building in New York. While dying of burns covering 95% of his body, he said he did it to make people hear. He died the next day, on November 10, 1965. During this period, the protest escalated from a civilian act to a rebellion within the army itself, a revolution from within. 3. On June 30, 1966, privates Dennis Mora, Puerto Rican, James Johnson, African American, and David Samas, of Lithuanian-Italian-American descent, became the first American servicemen to publicly refuse deployment to Vietnam. At a press conference attended by 40 cameras, they condemned the war as immoral, illegal, and unjust. Their unity from different ethnic backgrounds showed that this was a war against the war, not divided by racial or class lines. Mora declared, "The struggle for freedom can be fought here, in our own country." Pete Seeger wrote a ballad about their story that became a folk song. David Harris, Architect of Defiance. David Harris, former Stanford student body president, left his post in February 1967 to focus on the national movement. He founded the organization, The Resistance. Harris delivered over 500 speeches in 20 states and collected and returned over 25,000 draft cards by 1970. His strategy was the mathematics of disobedience. If enough young men refused cooperation with the Selective Service, the system would be blocked and unable to prosecute them all. Baltimore 4. On October 27, 1967, Catholic activists, Father Philip Berrigan, Tom Lewis, David Eberhardt, and Reverend James Mengel, carried out the first raid on a draft board. They entered the Baltimore Custom House and poured blood, partially their own, on draft records. For them, this was a sacred act, and Philip Berrigan, sentenced to 6 years in prison, later wrote that, "The state can make laws, but it has no license to kill in Southeast Asia or anywhere else." Over 100 raids on draft boards followed between 1967 and 1972. During this period, the protest reached a national level as stars and intellectuals joined the movement, challenging the legitimacy of the war. Muhammad Ali, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong." On April 28, 1967, world boxing champion and member of the Nation of Islam, Muhammad Ali, refused to be inducted, not stepping forward at the Houston Induction Center. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and banned from boxing. In 1971, the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the conviction. Ali's famous quote connected the anti-war stance with the fight against racism and imperialism. "No Viet Cong ever called me a nigger. I don't want to go 10,000 miles from here to help murder and burn another poor people, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters." Ali chose conscience, becoming a symbol of moral courage. The Boston Five. On January 5, 1968, Dr. Benjamin Spock, famous pediatrician and parenting author, Reverend William Sloane Coffin, Mitchell Goodman, Marcus Raskin, and Michael Ferber were indicted for conspiracy, counseling, and aiding draft evasion. The symbolic significance of this trial was enormous. Spock, an authority for millions of American families, stood alongside the young activists. Spock and the others, except Raskin, were convicted and sentenced to 2 years, though the Court of Appeals later overturned the case on procedural grounds. Spock stated, "I am not too old to go to jail for my convictions. An unjust war requires non-cooperation." The climax of Catholic activism was the raid by the quote-unquote Catonsville Nine on May 17, 1968. 9 people, including 2 priests, Philip Berrigan and Daniel Berrigan, entered the Selective Service office in Catonsville, Maryland. They destroyed 378 draft files using homemade napalm, gasoline, and soap. And notably, they prayed the Our Father during their arrest. This was a theater of conscience, a deliberate, public violation of the law aimed at directly confronting the war. Daniel Berrigan's famous statement explained their philosophy. "Our apologies, dear friends, for the disorder, for the burning of paper instead of children, for the anger of officials at the front door of the death house. We could not, God help us, do otherwise." For the Berrigans, this was not an act of anger, but an act of love for the young people whose lives were at stake. In the end, all 9 were sentenced to a total of 18 years in prison and fined $22,000. In his court statement, Daniel Berrigan spoke of the land of burning children, explaining the incompatibility of war with their Christian faith. After Catonsville, the movement to destroy draft records expanded, moving into a phase of organized operations. This was a rationally organized campaign of civil disobedience, rather than spontaneous outbursts of anger. The Milwaukee 14. On September 24, 1968, 14 people, including 5 priests, broke into the Brumder Building in Milwaukee. They destroyed approximately 10,000 files from 9 Wisconsin draft boards using homemade napalm. For the Catholic activists, this was the destruction of sin. Consequently, they were sentenced to a month in jail without the possibility of a $415,000 bail, and most served at least a year. The Camden 28. The climax of this movement was the Camden 28 raid on August 22, 1971, in Camden, New Jersey. 28 anti-war activists aimed to destroy the records of all draftees with 1A status. The FBI monitored the operation through an informer. Over 40 FBI agents documented the raid. 20 activists were arrested on the spot, and 8 were arrested later. They faced up to 47 years in prison. The trial in the spring of 1973 became one of the most significant of the 20th century. This incident demonstrated that the movement was strong enough to attract the full attention of the FBI, and that the state feared people burning papers. Imprisonment was the real price of refusal. And the stories of the people behind bars reveal spiritual crises and suffering. Randy Keller, the man who inspired a revolution. 25-year-old activist Randy Keller refused conscientious objector status because he believed it was a form of cooperation with the government. He was sentenced to 2 years and served 22 months. His speech at Haverford College in August 1969 inspired Daniel Ellsberg, who later leaked the Pentagon Papers. Keller believed that never, ever think that your actions, especially if they are acts of conscience, won't matter. Nobody knows who may be listening or watching. Philip Berrigan in prison. Letters on reshaping the world. Catholic activist Philip Berrigan spent about 11 years in various prisons for his acts of protest. His letters about prison life, justice, and faith were published as Widen the Prison Gates, Writing from Jails. Berrigan never recanted his beliefs and viewed prison not as punishment, but as an opportunity to live with the poor and understand that justice is not an abstraction. It is a living human being who needs food, shelter, and dignity. The draft resistance movement found its powerful echo in culture, where artists, poets, and writers transformed art into a weapon of conscience. Allen Ginsberg, poet of the Revolution. Poet Allen Ginsberg wrote numerous anti-war poems, with Wichita Vortex Sutra, 1966, occupying a central place. Ginsberg, one of the main voices of the counterculture, participated in demonstrations and believed that poetry could be a political act. In his poem, he proclaimed, "I here declare the end of the war. May the states tremble, may the nation weep." Jane Fonda, the movie star who chose conscience. Actress Jane Fonda actively supported the movement in 1970, founding FTA, Free the Army, an anti-war troop that performed near military bases. She became an honorary national coordinator for the Vietnam veterans against the war. Fonda went further than most activists, explaining her choice. "I decided I had to return to my country and join them, the active duty GIs and Vietnam veterans in particular, to try and end the war. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. This organization, founded on June 1, 1967, by 6 Vietnam veterans, became the voice of soldiers who recognized the injustice of the war. VVAW organized operations, including the Winter Soldier Investigation, 1971. Their existence demonstrated that the anti-war movement had support even among people who knew the war from the inside. For thousands of young people, refusing the war meant not imprisonment, but exile. Between 50,000 and 125,000 Americans fled to Canada, which offered them an alternative path without inquiring about their military status. The Underground Railroad for Refugees. Officially, between 20,000 and 40,000 people were recognized as refugees, while the total number of immigrants, including deserters, could reach up to 125,000. By 1971 to 1972, Canada was receiving more immigrants from the U.S. than from any other country. Initially, groups like Students for Peace Action aided the refugees, and later, specialized organizations such as the Toronto Anti-Draft Program emerged. Mark Satin wrote The Manual for Draft-Age Immigrants to Canada, 1968, which sold nearly 100,000 copies, serving as a practical guide for escape. For many, fleeing became a choice between two wrongs: killing and criminality. Those who stayed in Canada. About half of the refugees remained in Canada after 1977, with many becoming prominent figures in Canadian culture and politics, including writer William Gibson and lawyer Geoffrey House. The influx of these young, educated people was a loss for America and a gain for Canada, enriching its arts and academic sectors. The closure of this chapter in history was accompanied by the state's attempts to resolve the consequences of mass draft refusal. President Ford, conditional amnesty. On September 16, 1974, President Gerald Ford offered the Earned Reentry Program. It required draft evaders to complete 2 years of alternative service, which was essentially another conditional sentence. Only about 1/6 of those eligible applied, and the program was rejected by both amnesty advocates and conservatives. Activists demanded recognition of their moral correctness, not reshaping by the system. President Carter, unconditional pardon. On January 21, 1977, on his first day in office, Jimmy Carter signed Proclamation 4483, granting unconditional pardon to all who evaded the draft, requiring no conditions. This did not, however, extend to deserters. Carter stated, "I believe in amnesty for those who refuse to serve in a war which many Americans considered to be unwise and wrong." This act acknowledged that the people who refused to participate in the mistake were morally right. The history of draft resistance during the Vietnam War remains one of the greatest acts of civil disobedience in American history, demonstrating the power of personal moral choice. The statistics of resistance are striking. 210,000 people were officially charged, around 8,800 convicted, and approximately 4,000 of them received prison sentences for conscientious objection. Over 100,000 people fled to Canada. In addition, more than 100 raids on draft boards occurred between 1967 and 1972. The results of this mass refusal included the abolition of the draft in 1972, the end of the war in 1973, and unconditional amnesty in 1977. Notably, the system did not shed the blood of a single activist, though 3, Herds, Morrison, Laporte, shed their own blood in conscious sacrifice. The philosophical significance lies in the fact that 4,000 people chose jail instead of killing. This showed that even a powerful state can be stopped when enough people decide that certain orders cannot be obeyed. The activists found something they were willing to live for, and if necessary, to die for. It was conscience. Ultimately, conscience proved stronger than war.